section 3 is called All Who Are Led by the Spirit. Remember exactly, it's Romans 8:14. All who are led by the Spirit of God are sons of God. Some early Quakers quoting that in court used inclusive language. They said, all who are led by the Spirit of God are sons and daughters of God. Including William Dewsbury, he's the one who liked to quote that in court. And early Quakers who appeared in court, and they were brought to court and put on trial often for various things, such as not taking off their hats to someone of a superior social status, not taking oaths. They often would quote scripture and convinced actually many judges who became Quakers. Anyway, so this morning we talked about sort of the journey toward discovering the presence of God, of Christ, of the light of Christ within, able to guide directly in the stages of longing, seeking, turning within, and then what happened once that discovery was made, the openings and the refining of fire. And one of the key things about that discovery was seeing that God's ways differed from the ways of society in many respects. And that if you wanted to be faithful and live according to God's ways, God's love, God's truth, that required becoming different from your society. Becoming different from your society was not easy, and they found that the next element of the Quaker spiritual journey, community, was really essential in helping to live a faithful life. Community of people who shared your faith and your practice and that experience of that direct guidance. And the guidance was really not just for individuals, it was even more for the communities. And God was calling people into community. Among the early friends, there were many friends who lived in areas where there weren't others around them, but they maintained a network of connection. So if you lived in isolation, you wrote letters to other friends, and friends who traveled in the ministry would go and visit what they called isolated friends. So there was this network, this web of community that was created to support one another. Community is one of the elements of the Quaker spiritual journey that we do talk about a lot in our time. And it's something I'm going to be speaking about tomorrow morning. The talk is called the community of faithfulness. But here are some of the ways that they spoke about their experience of community, the way of being drawn into oneness with each other, with love with each other. John Banks, we looked at his journal earlier, talked about how that deep oneness that they experienced, that came partly through experiencing trials and difficulties together. And in the same inward sense and feeling of the Lord's power and presence, we enjoyed one another and were near and dear one unto another. But it was through various trials and deep exercises, with fear and trembling, that on this wise we were made partakers. And I should say that in describing their experiences of worship, they spoke often of the Lord's power and presence. They experienced that power and presence among them. And it was the power that they experienced that gave them the ability to be faithful, to do what God asked of them, to overcome things that they began to see were not God's ways. In the north of England, Margaret Fell, who lived at Swarthmore Hall, this nice big manor house, kept her house open as a place for people who traveled in the ministry. She was considered a mother of Quakerism. She took it upon herself to help organize the movement. Her husband, Judge Fell, helped give it some legal protection while he was alive. But people who felt called to travel in the ministry would let her know about it, and she would keep track of their trials. Their travels, they would write her letters, and so she helped keep them in communication with each other and say, people here need a visit and so forth. Another thing she did is raise money. raised money to help support the traveling ministers if they needed shoes or coats or books or money to take a ship somewhere. She'd have to raise that money. When people were put in prison, as Quakers often were for their witness and their testimony, in those days you didn't get fed in prison unless your relatives brought you food or you paid for it, and the same with bedding. So she also raised money for the people who were in prison so that they could buy food or bedding if there weren't friends nearby to bring it to them. So here's just a little piece of one of her fundraising letters, talking about not everyone's called to travel in ministry, not everyone's called to risk going to prison, but everyone sort of as part of the body of Christ is called to share in this. Everyone, in their measures, may be serviceable to the whole body in what is called for and required, and who dwells in the light and makes subject to be serviceable to the body. So let that love constrain you to love one another and be serviceable to one another. Another way that early friends testified to the experience of the power of community was the spiritual power that they felt coming to them from the community, from the prayers of the community, sustaining them even when they were in prison or experiencing difficulties. Catherine Evans and Sarah Chevers, two married women who traveled in the ministry together. They're mothers of children. It was common in those days that those who were called to the ministry were paired up with someone else, usually a woman with another woman, a man with another man. It was rare for even a married couple to travel together. There's something a little bit scandalous about that. I think there were a few married couples who traveled together, but mostly it was 2 men and 2 women. So Catherine Evans and Sarah Chavez traveled together. They were imprisoned, I believe, in Scotland, and then they both had a leading to go to Alexandria to bring the Quaker message to Alexandria. They never made it. They stopped on the island of Malta, where they were imprisoned by the Inquisition and kept in prison for 3 years, subjected on a regular basis to questioning and to the Inquisition. And the Jesuits who were the inquisitors were surprised by the answers that they gave, and we have some things that they wrote from prison. But during those 3 years, they spent about a year of that time in solitary confinement, separated even from each other. And sometimes they went without food. So sometimes they thought they were close to death. But in this little passage, they testify to feeling spiritual support coming to them from the community and from the prayers of the community, even when they were in isolation. We did see you, our dear friends, and did behold your order and steadfastness of your faith and love to all saints, and were refreshed in all the faithful-hearted, and felt the issues of love and life which did stream from the hearts of those that were wholly joined to the fountain, and were made sensible of the benefit of your prayers. Remembering that sensible here means sensitive. We were sensitive to the benefit of your prayers. They use a metaphor here that was one of my favorite metaphors of early friends that I encountered, which was referring to God as a fountain, or fountain of love, sometimes fountain of love and life. I think this metaphor was powerful to them because that they sometimes experienced the presence of God, the presence of the Spirit within them flowing through them the way a fountain would. Or they talk about streaming through them, so that they felt the issues, again, something flowing out of you. So we felt the issues of love and life which did stream from our hearts, from the hearts of those that were wholly joined in the fountain. So they're friends, in prayer, joined with the fountain of God's love. There's something real that they could feel, that they could perceive, like flowing out of them and toward these imprisoned friends. It just makes me wonder how many people have felt the Spirit, like flowing through them, like water or a fountain. Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to move on to leadings, as I said, communities. somewhat familiar. 2 friends today, pretty familiar. So are leadings. Leadings of the Spirit. So these first elements, these after the openings, so the openings are revelations of God's ways that require them to change. The refiner's fire is the difficulty of making those changes. The community supports one another in being faithful. And all of that is sort of about putting your personal house and your community relations in order according to how God would have you live. And as you sort of surrender your personal life and your community sort of surrenders its guidance to God and to Christ, then you're called a step further to participate in the ministry, God's ministry, the ministry of Christ in the world. And that sometimes takes you beyond your own community, the leadings of the Spirit. And those leadings can be in small things and in large things. So we talked about personal leadings included no longer wearing fancy clothing, so plain clothing and plain speech. Because both of those things, fancy clothing and dishonest speech, supported the class structure, the unequal class structure. Another thing that early friends were led to was not to pay tithes. So it was the law that you're supposed to pay a tithe, or a tenth of your income, to the local parish priest. In those days, the church and the state were not separate. So even if you didn't attend church, even if you found no spiritual nurture in the church, and that's why you left it, you were required to pay a tithe to the parish priest, and if you didn't, the priest sued you in court, and often they would take away more than the value of your tithe, more, 2 or 3 times more, and sometimes if people didn't have money, they would take away the tools of their trade, like their looms or their horses that they plowed with. And so the leading not to pay tithes, which is a leading to the whole community, often had a cost, a difficult cost to it, and many friends went to prison for that. They also felt called to, as in obedience to some scripture, to let their yea be yea and their nay be nay. That is, to be truth tellers in all circumstances. So the requirement to put your hand on the Bible and swear you were going to tell the truth implied a double standard, that only when you did that would you be truthful, and all other times you could say what you wanted. But Quakers said no, they were called to be truthful in all circumstances. And so they wouldn't take an oath, and they were often thrown in prison or kept in prison for refusing to do that. So the leadings were in personal things and small things, community leadings, and then larger leadings. So I want to give an example here of a personal leading. William Caden. It was a personal leading, but it also really served God's purposes. So William Caden was a young man who was brought up in the Fell household. And it was common for young people, members of the gentry, to try to place their children in a fine home, to be brought up with a fine education and breeding and so forth. So William Caden was brought up in the Fell household, which had 7 daughters and 1 son, so he was like the second son in the family. With the rest of the Fell family, he became a Quaker at an early age, and he was one of the valiant 70. As a teenager, he started traveling in the ministry with George Fox and others. And as he got older, he began to feel a leading to go with a few friends who took the Quaker message to Holland. And while he was there, he learned Dutch. This later became very important to friends when John Bowman wanted to gain religious freedom for the colony of New Netherlands, that there were Quakers in Holland who spoke Dutch. In any case, William Caden ended up staying in Holland because he fell in love with a Dutch woman, and he began to feel a leading to marry her. And this is a little piece of a letter he wrote to George Fox and Margaret Fell, saying, I'm feeling this leading and sort of seeking your guidance about it. He was also seeking the guidance of the Friends community there in Holland. So he's talking about his leading to marry Anakin. This thing settled in me and grew clearer and clearer. For the longer it continued, the more assurance I came to have in myself of the thing being of the Lord. And in the meantime it came to be shown unto me how I should proceed in the thing. As first of all, I was to propound it to some dear friends to hear and receive their advice. And so much subjection I found then in my spirit, that if they had no unity with the thing, that then I could, I believe, have let the thing fall and rested satisfied about it. So this is perhaps the earliest account we have of a clearness committee for marriage. And he's sort of discerning in himself. You know, is this just a thought? Is it just an infatuation? Is it just is just a flashing thought and it could be dispelled? But over time it became more and more clear that this was not just a thought and not just a personal attraction, but a real leading from God. But then he was willing to surrender this to his community and to the discernment of his community to see if they also felt it was a leading from God. And he's telling George Fox and Margaret Fell that he believes that if the community says they don't think this is from God, that he could accept that, their discernment. So it's also an example of the role that the community could have in helping to discern leadings, which originally Quakers felt they were so excited about the discovery of the direct guidance of God and Christ that they weren't discerning. It's like, wow, you know, I have this leading and I'm going to follow it. And then they discovered that sometimes people could be mistaken about their leadings, and it was really beneficial to have the community help with discernment. And that's one example. So as a community, they felt a common leading to share the good news that they discovered, the good news that Christ is present within, ready to guide people directly. This was liberating news. It was news that they felt called to share sort of to the ends of the earth. And some of them went to the farthest reaches. In fact, 6 of them took the message, or felt led to take the message to the Sultan of Turkey. The Sultan of Turkey at that time was considered by Christians to be the personification of evil. And so, you know, the leading to take this message to the Sultan of Turkey was quite a remarkable thing. In fact, 6 of them got on a ship and eventually got to Turkey, but only one of them ever actually got to see the Sultan, and that was Mary Fisher. But that's one example. Mary Fisher was actually the first one to take the message in the opposite direction. She and her partner, Ann Austin, took it to Boston, where they were very poorly received, unlike their reception by the Sultan of Turkey. But so a few friends got the leading to take them and to share the message widely. Some of them just to share it in their neighborhood or in the next town, but some of them felt called to actually leave their homes and travel in ministry for a much longer period of time. Some of them never came home. And the next example is one of those. Marmaduke Stevenson was a young farmer who got his leading while plowing. And I'll read this description, but those of you who are familiar with accounts in the Bible of say, Jeremiah's leading, we'll see echoes of that. Quakers are really steeped in biblical language, and their own language is often filled with biblical phrases and images, even though they don't cite the passages. So remember, Marmaduke Stevenson was called, first of all, just God let him know that he was called to be a prophet and to take the message to other nations. Later on, he got the message, now is the time to go to Barbados. And Barbados was an island stop for those sort of heading toward North America. Many ships stopped in Barbados. And in fact, Mary Fisher stopped there in Austin and helped to start a Quaker community, and a thriving Quaker community. So many people who were traveling toward North America would stop in Barbados, help nurture the community in Barbados, and then go on to the colonies. So Marmaduke Stevenson got a leading to go to Barbados. After he was in Barbados, he got a leading to go to New England. But I love the language of this leading that he experienced. As I walked after the plow, I was filled with the love and living presence of the living God, which did ravish my heart when I felt it, for it did increase and abound in me like a living stream. So did the love and life of God run through me like precious ointment, giving a pleasant smell, which made me to stand still. And as I stood a little still with my heart and mind stayed on the Lord, the word of the Lord came to me in a still small voice, which I did hear perfectly, saying to me in the secret of my heart and conscience, I have ordained thee a prophet to the nations. And at hearing the word of the Lord, I was put to a stand, being that I was but a child for such a weighty matter. So at the time appointed, Barbados was set before me, unto which I was required of the Lord to go, and leave my dear and loving wife and tender children. For the Lord said to me immediately by his Spirit that he would be as a husband to my wife, and as a father to my children, and they should not want in my absence, for he would provide for them when I was gone. And I believed that the Lord would perform what he had spoken, because I was made willing to give up myself to his work and service, to leave all and follow him, whose presence is with me. This is from one of the letters he wrote from prison in Boston after he was condemned to death. And he was one of 4 Quakers hung in Boston. So it's a beautiful, beautiful experience of receiving this leading and receiving the assurance from God. And I don't know if we have a record of how well his family were taken care of afterwards. I have to assume that the Quaker community, as they did with others, stepped in to help support them. But it leads us to a reflection on the next element, which is living in the cross. Or a cross to our wills, my friends often said. Living in the cross is not so much a theology of the cross, because all of these elements are elements of experience, but the experience of learning to do God's will, even if it's different from your own will or your own preferences for how your life is going to go. So in the story of Marmaduke Stevenson, the farmer, the young farmer with a wonderful wife and children, his idea would have been to stay at home and raise his family. But God had a different plan for him. And that's a big leading. I mean, a leading to a big change and to giving over his whole life. For many of us, for most of us, the leadings that we get, at least at first, are smaller and more manageable. Barbara Bludgeon was a governess in Bristol. Bristol was one of the biggest cities in England at the time. I think it was number 2 after London. And there were a lot of seekers in that town. So when the first Quakers came with the Quaker message, there were a lot of people who were hungry for it and ready to receive it, and they began to have such large meetings that they couldn't fit in any building anymore, so they met in orchards. And they had sort of really powerful, spirit-filled meetings. Barbara Bludgeon was a governess there. That is, she worked for rich families, teaching their children. And of course, if you worked for a rich family, you had to wear nice, fancy clothes too. Not as fancy as the people you worked for, but your clothes would show your social status. So hearing the Quaker message about wearing plain clothing, that was a cross to her to change. And she wrote, "As the evil was made manifest, I departed from it, and willingly took up the cross and yielded obedience unto it, in plainness of speech and in my habit, meaning my clothing. And the people were so offended with it, when I went into their public places and steeple houses to speak, that they took away their children from me, so that I lost almost all my employment. And they kept me in prison a quarter of a year at a time. And great was my sufferings in that day, but the Lord so filled me with his power that I was preserved through it all." So she's talking about a series of leadings. And in fact, one that I didn't put here is one of her leadings was to give up beer and wine and meat for a year. In that time, most people drank beer and wine because water wasn't always safe. But she drank water for a year and found that it was a help to her in her spiritual journey. But living in the cross, doing those things that are hard, that might require sacrifice or suffering or loss of things that are dear, in this case her job as a governess. Elizabeth Houghton is one of my favorite early friends. She was in some ways the second Quaker after George Fox. George Fox was 19 years old and just beginning to wander around England and to have experiences and to be sharing about them and not having a good reception anywhere until he came to this part of where Elizabeth Houghton is. She lived in the little village of Skegby, which I believe is near Mansfield. Not quite sure. Anyway, so when he came to that town, I'm sure he went to every town and said, who are the people really interested in the spiritual life? And I'm sure the people in the town said, oh, go see Elizabeth Houghton. So George Fox was 19 and Elizabeth Houghton was 47 years old. She was a farmer's wife. She was already pretty zealous about her religious life, having joined with a group of what were called General Baptists. There were two kinds of Baptists in that time. They were also called Anabaptists because they came from the Anabaptist strain. That is, they believed not in the baptism of infants, but of mature believers. But the Calvinist Baptists were particular Baptists, and those who believed that a general salvation was available to all, that God hadn't already decided where you were going to go, were the General Baptists, and she was part of that group. And they were at that time the most radical sect. They believed in some of the things that became Quaker beliefs. I mean, they didn't pay tithes to the state church, for instance. They believed in the ministry of lay people. You didn't have to go to seminary and get a seminary degree to be a preacher. And in their own gatherings, they allowed the ministry of women. So Elizabeth Houghton joined this group. And when people became disappointed and disillusioned at the end of the Civil War, some of the members of her group decided they would rather play sports on Sundays than have church services. So she took the remnant who were still interested in and zealous about their spiritual life, and they began to meet in her farmhouse, which did not please her husband at all because it wasn't legal at that time. And they almost divorced over it. But Elizabeth Houghton met there and her children were part of it. And then one day George Fox came to this group and was welcomed into the group and told his experiences. He wrote in his journal that Elizabeth Houghton was a very tender-hearted woman. That group listened to George Fox's message. They sort of followed his directions. They too discovered the light of Christ within them, guiding them. They changed their name to Children of the Light, and they became the first Quaker group. Children of the Light was the first name for Quakers. Anyway, so Elizabeth Houghton was the first traveling Quaker minister after George Fox. He was soon imprisoned in Derby, which was nearby, and she was soon imprisoned in Derby with him. The first document we have from the Quaker movement was written in her hand, a letter to the mayor of Derby. And George Fox copied her letter and signed his own name. That might seem like plagiarism, except that that's what we do with our own elected officials. You know, somebody will write a letter and we'll copy it and sign our own name, saying that we believe the same thing. So Elizabeth Houghton spent time in prison, and then she went home, and then she got a sense that she was supposed to go out and, preach or share the message again, and soon she was in prison again. And then by that time, her husband was supporting her and sort of joined the Quaker faith, and they were a happy family again. And she was ready to stay at home with her happy family, and she felt led to go out again. And so she wrote a letter about the struggle that happens. You know, the voices inside you. One voice that says, "I need you to keep sharing this message," and another voice that says, "Oh, you've done enough already. You know, just stay home and be comfortable." So this is just a little piece from a longer letter. "Oh, dear friends, when the Lord has set you free and brought you into joy, then you think you have overcome all. But there is a daily cross to be taken up while the fleshly will remaineth. So Elizabeth Newton is one of the most remarkable examples of someone who went again and again and again. She was led to come to New England after the king prohibited the hanging of any more Quakers. The Puritans in Boston created new punishments, whipping people and leaving them in the woods on the border. And she was led to come to New England at that time, and again and again she was whipped and left at the border. She recovered in Rhode Island, and she went back to New England. And they couldn't believe that she was in her 60s and then 70 by then, and they just couldn't believe that this woman just kept coming back. Yeah. Does anyone have a question or a comment to make about that, living in the cross? All right, I'll go on. Oh, here's one.
Kind of knew all this, but I read in Fox's Journal last year, February, or something like that. I kind of went along Quakerism 101 journey kind of thing. But anyways, one of the things that he said about transformation was not to fear what the light revealed, but that same light that made the revelation of what might be contrary to God's will or the Spirit's life in you would actually be the transforming power to do that change. You didn't have to sit out and do some big fast this long, quit doing this, stop doing that, but in surrender, the light that showed you that would be the same light that would make the transformation and the change by the power of the Spirit.
Thank you. And that's what the next element is about.
Sorry.
No, that's perfect. Abiding in divine love and power. In my book, I shortened it just to abiding. So these things that people were asked to do, some of them were really hard and challenging and fearful, and the consequences were painful and sometimes cost your health or your life. So it was the power that came from God, from the Spirit, from Christ, that enabled them to do these things and even to have joy while doing them. And that bonded them together in this incredible love that made the doing of them joyful and helped them to feel the presence of God and the Spirit even as they were doing these things. I'm thinking of telling a story before looking at the abiding things. Some people, I've read some historians of American history say that the Quakers had a martyr complex, that they were seeking martyrdom. And that's why, for instance, Elizabeth Who kept going back to New England after being beaten there. And I don't believe, after reading their writing, that they wanted to be martyred, that they wanted to suffer, that they wanted to go to prison, that they wanted to lose the things they lost. But there was something larger that motivated them. And they might not themselves have been able to see the consequences of what they did. Sort of only by looking at history can you see the consequences, some of the consequences of what they did, or the consequence of their testimony in the colonies, which helped make religious freedom it was something new in the world. And their fight for their own religious freedom helped to bring about, to establish religious freedom as a foundation for a lot of the colonies and later for the country that was established. They couldn't see that happening in their lifetime, but some of them felt it, some of them knew that this was part of God's work in the world, part of God's work of bringing something new into the world. So we might say, well, every soldier who goes into war has a martyr complex too. You know, if people are willing to give their life for a cause bigger than themselves, and that's what they were willing to do. To be faithful, even if it costs them something great. So I want to tell a story of the Woodhouse, which is one of my favorite early Quaker stories. I told it last year at Ben Lomond, I believe. And I have so there are a few people here who heard it. And I sort of hate to repeat myself, but I love this story, so I'm going to tell it again. How many people know the story of the Woodhouse? It's worth hearing many times. So there are a few people who have heard it, but most people have not heard it. The Woodhouse is the name of a boat. It's a house made out of wood that can float on the water. And the story is told by Robert Fowler, who's the shipbuilder. He wasn't one of the Quaker traveling ministers, so he, in his account of this journey, he's more, he tells more personal details than some of the ministers did in their accounts of traveling in the ministry. And it's another one of those wonderful accounts like Mary Pennington's journal. So Robert Fowler is this shipbuilder and ship captain in Yorkshire, which is on the east side of London, and so he sails ships around in the Channel and the Mediterranean, sort of locally. And he's building a ship to do that. And he's a newly convinced Quaker. I believe he'd been convinced by William Dewsbury. And while he's building his ship, he keeps hearing God say something that means there's a reason for this boat. And he's like, oh, God has a reason for this boat. I wonder what it is. And he said scenes came to his mind of New England. But this boat was too small to cross the ocean, so he didn't know what that was about, and he pushed it out of his mind. And maybe I should say in the meantime that after the first Quakers went to Boston, Mary Fisher and Mary Austin, and then there was a boat that had Mary Dyer and her companion. And Mary Dyer and her companion didn't even go to share the Quaker message. Mary Dyer was just going home to Rhode Island. But she was put in prison. The Puritans had heard about the Quakers and thought they were blasphemers and heretics and put them in prison right away. Then there was a boat with eight Quakers on it, and they were immediately put in prison and taken on trial. And one of them was this young man trained in the law named Christopher Holder. So they took him to court, and he said, we're English citizens just as you are, and you have no right to put us on trial. You have no laws against Quakers. So they put this boat of Quakers, sent them back to England right away, and started making laws against Quakers. So the laws that they made said any ship owner or ship's captain that brought Quakers to our colony would be fined. So immediately there were no ship captains willing to sail people to Boston or to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then they started making stricter laws. So back in London, there's all the 8 people that were sent back. Out of 8, 6 of them are ready to go back. Plus there are 5 more who are feeling led to go to the colonies. And there's no ship captain willing to take them to the colonies. So Robert Fowler sails his little boat to London, and he goes to see Gerard Roberts, who was we would say the clerk of the committee, whose responsibility was to find transportation for people with leadings to take the Quaker message somewhere. So Robert Fowler goes to Gerard Roberts and his committee and says, well, I have this boat, and I keep having the sense that God has a purpose for my boat, but I don't know what it is. And so they listened to his story, and they said, oh, we know what it is. This boat is going to take these 11 friends over to the colonies. And Robert Fowler said, well, this boat is too small to cross the ocean. And they said, well, we think God wants this boat for that purpose. And he says, okay, you can have it. You can have it. And so then they tried to find a captain, and no captain was willing, first of all, to sail a ship that small across the ocean, and second of all, to sail it to the colonies because of the laws that were being made against ship's captains. So then they said to Robert Fowler, well, you have to be the one to captain this boat. And his first frank response was, no way. I'm not willing to risk my life and to risk, not seeing my wife and children again. And they said, well, we'll send George Fox to talk to you. And in this case, George Fox did go and talk with Robert Fowler, and he said, and Robert Fowler wrote, and by that instrument of God, I was made willing. So he did captain the boat, and there were all these troubles with getting a crew. They sailed with a crew that was too small because the Navy took too many. But they stopped along the coast, and the 11 traveling ministers got off and shared the Quaker message at various places, and they got more crew. And then before they actually left the coast of England, they found 3 great big ships that were going toward Newfoundland. And who'd been there before, and they said, oh, you can sail along with us. That'll help protect you because there are pirates on the sea and Dutch warships. So the seas were kind of dangerous. So now they're in the open seas. The Quakers have a practice of having meeting for worship on the deck. There were only 3 days in the whole journey that were too stormy for them to have meeting for worship on the deck. And after meeting for worship, they would give instructions to the pilot of the ship, who wasn't a Quaker. But apparently he followed the instructions. And then one day in worship, Humphrey Norton says, we're going to run into trouble, but don't worry, God says we'll be okay. And so that day they saw pirate ships on the horizon coming toward them, and the 3 big ships, they immediately sailed off in a different direction, leaving the Woodhouse house alone to face the pirate ship. But the Lord sent a contrary wind in the face of the pirate ship. And so they got through that danger and a number of other dangers. And it was really interesting to see the stories that he tells about sort of their inward condition and how it was reflected in their dreams and in the condition of the seas and the messages they got in meeting for worship. For instance, after 5 weeks, they had only crossed a third of the way, and they were going to run out of food if they continued at that rate. But again, Humphrey Norton was reassured that they would make it, and was even given a date. And in fact, they did make it on the date that he was given. They made it safely. And so not all of them were actually led to go to Boston. 5 of them were actually led to go to New Netherlands, which was the Dutch colony, and some of them were feeling led to go to the southern colonies. And as it turned out, the ship landed off of Long Island and went immediately to Manhattan, which was good news to the 5 of them who wanted to end up in New Netherlands because they hadn't known how they were going to get there. So they got off the ship. The Dutch were not really happy because the ship wasn't flying the flag of a nation and didn't salute them with guns. And when they came on the ship to inspect it, people didn't take off their hats. They didn't show enough respect. So the captain and Robert Hodgkins were taken to meet Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of the colony, who thought that they were headed to Rhode Island only. And Rhode Island was at that time, Rhode Island had been started by people who'd been banished from Massachusetts. And it was considered by the Puritans to be the latrine of New England. That is, to have all kinds of unorthodox religious beliefs. So Peter Stuyvesant felt like, okay, if they're going to Rhode Island, it's all right, I'll let them go. And so they did. And he didn't know that 5 of them were getting off in New Netherlands. They soon arrested 2 of them, 2 women who were preaching in the streets of Manhattan. 3 of them went out into the colonies to Long Island, where they met some little towns of English settlers who had originally come and settled in New England and found that religious environment too oppressive, and then had moved and established little towns on Long Island. So for the next 2 years, the passengers of the Woodhouse were basically the only Quakers in the colonies to spread the message. They did bring the message widely. They started a lot of Quaker meetings. And they also suffered a lot. So they had a lot of reassuring experiences during their ride across the ocean, a sense of God really guiding them. They said it was like a horse being led by the hand. But 5 out of the 12, Robert Fowler, the ship's captain, sailed back right away. He wasn't led to travel with this message. But of the 11 who remained, 5 of them died. 4 of them drowned, just in boats in their travels. It was a dangerous country, hard to travel. One of them, it was just a leaky canoe and things like that. One of them was hanged. 2 of them had their ears cut off in Boston. One of them was branded in Connecticut. 2 of them were they were all beaten and put in prison, but 2 of them were beaten so brutally that it's really hard to read the descriptions of it. So this is an example of their living in the cross and the sacrifices that they made in order to bring this message to the colonies. But the effect that it had, as I said, that helping to bring religious freedom to the colonies, because the story that I got growing up in American history was that, the Pilgrim Fathers came for religious freedom, which is true. They came for their own religious freedom, and they didn't grant religious freedom to anyone whose ideas were very different from their own. They banished those people from their colonies, and if they came back, as the Quakers did, they beat them, and if they kept coming back, they hung them, and when they couldn't hang them anymore, they beat them more severely. So each colony was sort of established with one religion that was the state religion. In New Netherlands, it was the Dutch Reformed Church. Some of the colonies were Puritan, Maryland was Catholic, Virginia was Church of England, but each colony was established on one religion, and the Quaker witness eventually was part of helping to bring religious freedom to the colonies. So I'll stop with these examples of abiding. The spiritual power that enables people to give their lives over for God's purposes and to be part of God's work and God's ministry in the world. So Edward Burrough was the traveling companion of Francis Howgill, who wrote that beautiful passage. Actually, I've got both of those passages here. And who wrote about the power that they experienced in those meetings for worship. And while waiting upon the Lord in silence, as often we did for many hours together, with our minds and hearts toward Him, we received often the pouring down of the Spirit upon us, and the gift of God's holy, eternal Spirit, and our hearts were made glad. My voice is getting dry, so I'm wondering, Eric, if you'd be willing to read Francis Howgill?
Sure. We came to know a place to stand in, and what to wait in. And the Lord appeared daily to us, to our astonishment, amazement, and great admiration, insomuch that we often said one unto another with great joy of heart, What? Is the kingdom of God come to be with men? And holy resolutions were kindled in our hearts as a fire which the life kindled in us, to serve the Lord while we had a being. And from that day forward, our hearts were knit unto the Lord, and one unto another, in true and fervent love, in the covenant of life with God. And thus the Lord, in short, did form us to be a people for His praise in our generation.
So I quoted part of that earlier, but this is a later part of it. Holy resolutions were kindled in our hearts as a fire, which the life kindled in us to serve the Lord while we had a being, so that they were on fire with their love of God and joining with God's purposes. Our hearts were knit unto the Lord and one unto the other in true and fervent love. This deep spiritual bonding that came in that experience, in the covenant of life with God. And the Lord formed us to be a people for his praise in our generation. So that sense of being formed as a people, no longer just as individuals, but as a people. And the early friends often call themselves a people of God. I told you about Elizabeth Houghton and how many times she kept going back to New England even though she was being beaten and left at the frontier in the snow. And someone in one of her tracks, she said, people ask me, how could I do that? How could I keep doing that? Eric, I wonder if you would pass the microphone behind you, to the woman sitting behind you. One of the women sitting behind. Would you read Elizabeth Houghton's words?
All this and much more I have gone through and suffered, and much more could I for the seed's sake, which is buried and oppressed. Yes, the love that I bear to the souls of all men, making me willing to undergo whatsoever can be inflicted.
Thank you. Just hold on to it for a moment. So the language might be a little obscure to us. So saying, I could go through all of this and suffer all this for the seed's sake. So the seed was our metaphor for that presence of Christ within, the light within, that something of God within them, which is buried and oppressed, so that they felt, in most people, that seed was buried and oppressed, that most people actually didn't have access to it, that they pushed it away, that they were ignoring it, denying it. And for the sake of that seed, that people might get in touch with it, that they might feel it, that they might begin to live with it and to heed it. She was willing to go through all of that in order to help free that seed in people. The love that I bear to the souls of all men, making me willing to undergo whatsoever can be inflicted. And that reminds me that she signed her letters, as did many other friends. She wrote lots of letters to magistrates, even to the king, describing what was wrong and how Quakers were being mistreated and so forth. And she would sign it depending upon whether it was addressed to one person or more than one person, a lover to thy soul or a lover to your souls. I'm sorry, I think it's wonderful. A lover to your souls. I'm just reminded of another wonderful Elizabeth Houghton story. She was quite a character. As I said, she was 47 when George Fox was 19, so that later on in the Quaker movement, she was considered an ancient woman. She discovered that the king liked to play tennis. This was after the Civil War and the Restoration. King Charles II liked to play tennis. So she would go to the tennis court and wait till his tennis game was over, and as he was coming back to his carriage or whatever, she would go up to him and talk to him and tell him about the injustices that were being done to Quakers. And one of the things that was so scandalous about this is that ordinary people were not supposed to stand in the presence of the king. They're supposed to get down on their knees. And she would stand next to him as though she were his equal, and she would tell him what was going wrong in his colonies and what he should do to change it. And she, after she'd been kicked out of New England the first time and came home, she went to the king with a petition saying, I want to be able to buy a house in Massachusetts. I want the right to do that so that when I go to minister there, I have a place to stay, because now there were fines on anyone who gave housing to Quakers. And she actually persuaded the king to sign her petition. They didn't honor it in New England. She took it with her. And Mary Fisher, I told you, she was the only one of 6 friends who sailed toward Turkey who actually got to visit with the Sultan of Turkey, who was rather receptive, surprisingly receptive to her message. We don't know how much the translators may have changed her message, because any gesture of displeasure from the Sultan, and his executioner was there ready to take off the head of the person who displeased him. But at the end she said to him, she said, have you understood what I said? And he said, I understood every word of it, and I agree with it, and I invite you to stay and live in my country. And she said, no, thank you. He said, well, I'll give you a guard to escort you back. And she said, no thank you, the Lord, brought me here safely and will bring me safely back. But as I said, the Arab Muslim people were considered the enemies of Christendom, and yet she encountered, and she had to have walked, we don't know exactly how she got there and how much of the journey was by boat and how much by foot, but she walked through lands speaking only English, and she must have encountered lots of people. The Muslim culture is one in which you provide hospitality to strangers, and so she must have received a lot of hospitality along the way, even though she didn't speak the language, even though she's wearing strange clothes. And this is just a little bit from a letter she wrote after she got back from Turkey. Whoever's holding the microphone, would you hand it to the woman next to you? And would you read just that 2 lines from Mary Fisher, please?
There is a love begotten in me towards them which is endless. Though they be called Turks, the seed of them is near unto God, and their kindness hath been shown.
Thank you. Just examples of that love that people felt, the love that motivated them to take the Quaker message long distances to share it. And I'll read the last one from Mary Dyer. So this was, how many people know Mary Dyer's story? Probably most people here. Mary Dyer was one of 4 people hung in Boston by the Puritans, the only woman who was hung. And she was actually sentenced to death with Marmaduke Stevenson and William Robinson, and the 3 of them were marched to the gallows together. She was a mature woman, a mother of many children, and these were young farmers. And they walked to the gallows hand in hand, and people said to her, "Aren't you ashamed to be, walking like this as if you were going to your wedding?" And the Puritans were so afraid of the Quaker message getting out and affecting their colony that they had drummers marching beside them, beating the drums so that no one could talk to the Quakers. But someone actually did ask Mary Fisher what was going on, wrote down Mary Dyer's answer. She said, "This is to me an hour of the greatest joy I ever had in this world. No ear can hear, no tongue can utter, no heart can understand the sweet incomes or influence and the refreshings of the Spirit of the Lord, which now I feel." So issues, that's something flowing, incomes or influence, something's coming into her from God, which is just filling her with joy and peace. And she later said she felt like she'd been already in paradise for a few days. Actually, she was kind of surprised. Marmaduke was hung, and William Robinson was hung, and they took Mary Dyer up on the gallows, and they put the hood over her, and then the Puritans had staged this whole thing. Someone rode in on a horse and said, "She's reprieved." They were afraid of hanging a woman, so they reprieved her and sent her home. And in fact, her husband had written letters begging them to do that. And she went back home, but later, like half a year later, she heard that the Puritans were saying that reprieving her was proof of their leniency. So she went back to Boston, and they condemned her to death again, and this time they carried it out. But back in England, the Quakers in England were trying to convince Charles II to approve the charter for Rhode Island. Mary Dyer's husband was a lawyer who had helped to write the charter for Rhode Island, and they had written into the charter that religious freedom would be granted. And if the king agreed to this, it would be the first time that religious freedom was granted to any colony. And the Quakers in England were trying to persuade the king to sign this charter. And they told him, the Puritans in Massachusetts had been hanging Quakers, and they even hung a woman. And that's what persuaded Charles II to sign the charter, granting religion for Rhode Island, which granted religion. So it's all connected. It's all connected. And we have time for some small group sharing, and I just wonder if before we do that, if anyone wants to make a comment. Is that the right group? So here's a, is that a microphone?
So in one of these readings, it talks about then the two men being in the presence of God and feeling that at the same time together. Do you have other examples where people kind of both, where more than one person in a gathering had a sense of, or a same sense of the calling or the Spirit moving?
I'm not sure which passage you're referring to.
Let's see, it was, I think,
You're talking about Edward Burrow and Francis Helgill?
yes. And holy resolution was kindled in our hearts as fire which the life kindled in us. And they said that it was coming every day. And from that day forward, our hearts were knit unto the Lord. So they obviously were feeling something very similar to each other. Do you have other examples where people kind of had similar experiences at the same time?
I'm not thinking of any at the moment. I mean, these are experiences right at the beginning of the Quaker movement, after which the Valiant 70 spread out the message throughout England. So the fact that these people were willing to leave their homes meant that they too felt something similar, and that they too had felt that kindling of those resolutions. And in fact, the Valiant, did I say the Valiant 60? That's what they're called. There were actually nearly 70 people who were sent. And that was just at the very beginning. Later on, there were hundreds of people. There were 242 women in England who were noted either for writing Quaker tracts or for being put in prison. So this is public ministry of one sort or another. And so that's 242 women in a time when women really were not allowed to speak in public. And there were hundreds and hundreds more men. Thousands of Quakers were put in prison, and hundreds of them died there. And all of that was testimony to the power of the faith that they felt, that they were willing to do things that would have that kind of consequence. But I can't think at the moment of other writings where people said we felt the same thing at the same time. Thank you for asking.
Marcel, on my website, I have a journal of Charles Marshall, and he talks about the ministry of John Audlin and John Cam in Bristol in 1652, where many people were converted. And they did, according to that, in the meetings which lasted for hours and sometimes for days, they all were feeling the presence of God, according to Charles Marshall. So you might want to go read it. It's really quite moving.
I don't need a microphone. I don't know how to speak.
That's not the point, Charles. We're recording
It's
it.
being recorded.
Since you spoke of Mary Dia, I have a Mary Dia story.
Is it a short one? Is it a short one?
My great-grandfather's name was Dia Johnson. He was born a slave in Columbia, Tennessee, in the early part of the 19th century. I don't know to this day how it was that his parents, who were slaves, knew enough about Mary Dia to name him. His first name was Dia. His name was Dia Johnson. They knew who Mary Dia was. They must have known to have chosen that name for him. I don't know how that came about, because slaves were not allowed to go to school at that time. So how did he get enough knowledge of American history to know who Mary Dia was?
That's a mystery. Yeah, thank you.
But that is history.
we're getting to larger and larger sharing. So why don't, and here are the questions at the very bottom, questions. You can answer any one of these questions. I'll give you a few minutes to think about it, and then we'll form these groups of 4. Have you ever been moved to act by love greater than yourself? Have you served people because of a sense of God's love for them, or sacrificed for another person? In what ways have you or your community experienced God's power? So I'll just give a few minutes to reflect on which of those questions you might want to talk about in your small group. Time to close. And before we go into closing worship, I'd just like to invite people to reflect on, see if you can find 1 or 2 or 3 words about what you're taking from this day's discussion, sharing, reflection, reading of early friends. Just see if you can find 1 or 2 or 3 words of what you're going to be taking home with you. So it would take a lot of time if we pass around the microphone, but why don't you just call out a word and I'll repeat it into this microphone. What will you be taking home with you from today?
The tender heart.
The tender heart.
Trust my inner voice.
Trust my inner voice.
Truth is love.
Truth is love.
Community is a requirement.
Community as a
Requirement.
requirement.
Living waters.
The living waters.
Listen to your heart.
Listen to your heart.
Refiner's fire equals bread of life.
Refiner's fire equals bread of life. Thank you, friends. We close with some worship.
Make us into a people, Lord, meet for your service in this time and in this place. Draw us out of our own imaginings, our own agendas, the burdens that we carry that keep us from carrying the cross. Grant us a sense of your love for all people, that we might be drawn together in that same love. In the name and in the love of Jesus our friend. Amen. I echo Eric's words of thanks to you. Thanks to everyone who was here to join us today. The meeting of members of the Western Association will convene in a few short minutes. Let's take a 10-minute break and be back here for that meeting at about 10 to the hour. Charles?
Brian, I wanted to thank you and the members of the Berkeley Friends Church for hosting Quakers Heritage Day. And for many of us in the Bay Area, this is one of our highlights. We can't get to come out now. Quakers and everything. Get our bar and come over here. So thank you and your church so much.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. We couldn't do it without friends from the rest of the Bay Area. Otherwise, it would be half a dozen of us talking to one another. So, thank you all for being here. Go in peace.